I've got a whole lot of satisfying things done on this 64 custom Deluxe Reverb nonsense. I'm not sure quite where to start, so I'll just start. Had all these stupid plastic grommets, these push-in things that are just clunky and ugly. I've removed all those. I've put in some nice neoprene grommets. Personal preference, but it sure looks and feels a lot nicer to work with. You don't have the wires going up over the big hard-edged plastic lip. They had all the B-plus wires from the doghouse running all the way over here to a great big hole that you can't see because I need to move over here to a big hole here. They had all the wires going here. It's all heat-shrinked and stupid. So I have plugged up that hole so you don't put your fingers in and get zapped by anything in this area. And I have drilled a hole here with a grommet, and all the wires will go there. You can see the black wire here is ready for this ground. I'll run all the other wires a little bit. And I've got a repopulated board, 20 microfarad, 500 volts across the way with 10K 2-watt resistors, a little bit of neoprene, not neoprene, can't talk today, a little bit of silicone underneath, very neat, good mechanical support before solder is added. This little just screw right here, very nice. As you might recall, the output transformer the amp came in with was a non-original piece of shit. And the power transformer was an original piece of shit, a little puny thing. So I've got some hay bores in here, good quality stuff. I think the choke will be fine. I think the reverb driver transformer will be fine. But it's nice to have the good stuff in place. And it's done much like you might find in a pre-CBS era Deluxe Reverb. The 3 ceramic octal sockets are gone. I've replaced them with these phenolics. I've just had too many problems with the ceramics that Fender is using in the Reissue series. Same sockets. They're not great. And these are much closer to what you'd find in an old 60s Fender. The preamp tube sockets were all Beltons already. The one for the reverb driver was in bad shape. It had gotten too hot from bad factory soldering, and one of the pins was pushed out. So that's a new Belton here. The other 5 originals are just fine. The RCA jacks and speaker jacks and foot switch jack were all fine. I got all the old lead-free solder off, all the grainy, yucky stuff. Cleaned them all up, reinstalled them, so you have the reverb transformer wiring redone here much more neatly. I'm not going to go into all the gory details. They had miswired the driver socket like they do in most of the current Fenders. I've begun to do that correctly with the pin 6 to pin 1 connection looping around the tube rather than going across it. Nice, neat 20 gauge Teflon coated stranded wire used throughout. You'll be seeing a lot more of that soon. Like I said, original speaker jacks rewired properly. I still have to add the negative feedback wire, which will go over to the board. I guess they'll go here. New standby and power switches, standard Carlings, nothing special there. New fuse holder. That's a much better fuse holder. It doesn't have the quick connects. It's soldered, and it's got that brass nut. I like the brass nuts much better than plastic nuts on these things. You can see here I've added 3 ground lugs. This one is for the AC safety ground to go to. And this one will be for the octal, cathode octals for the power tubes, the 6v6s. So on the old ones it was soldered to chassis, but this chassis is very difficult to solder to. So this will be just fine. Thank you very much. You can see I have the blue and brown primary wires from the output transformer already connected to pin 3 at each octal socket for the 6v6s, but I've left them deliberately long just in case I need to reverse them. If this transformer were wound the way the old hay bores were, this is correct with blue and brown. If not, once the negative feedback is connected, I would have oscillation. So now I always remember to leave them long until I'm sure where they're going to be, then I'll neaten them up. You can always cut more wire off. You can't add wire back. Here you can see I've got the yellow wires connected to pins 8 and 2, and the red not to 4 and 6, but to 3 and 5, because I'm going to run diodes from 3 to 4 and from 5 to 6 in series with the tube rectifier, make this last better. And here you can see I've got the 2 black wires, the one from the power switch and the primary connected here, and the neutral and the white wire on the primary here. So this board, which had that filter cap, mains filter capacitor here, and then it had the thermistor there on the neutral. That's depopulated, but I'm using those as bridges. So it's nice and solid, looks pretty good. I've got all the secondaries neatly, tightly twisted here, and the green going over here to the heater. The heater's going to the lamp, and I'll run the rest of the wiring soon. I've got the bias tap going there to the repopulated bias board, 470 ohm, a nicely installed 1 in 4007, 47 microfarad 100 volt going over here, and the ground on this circuit is made with the chassis connection with this screw, which I hope is good. Once I get all this stuff put back together and all the screws are tight, I'll go in there with some Loctite so it can't move. You can see I've got the heater center tap here. The reservoir ground will also be made to the same ground lug later. And here you can see the other side of that hole plug. And the bias pot's all been cleaned up from its old bad solder. And you can see I've got some Fender washers added here. You know, Fender not as in Leo Fender, but as in great big surface area washers to reinforce the power of transformer mounting there. All the pots throughout the amp were quite good. This one had been replaced by a previous tech with that bad push-pull, so this is a new 1 meg J taper. If the original pot had been left there, I would have left the original pot in place. I did remove the old lead-free solder, all the old lead-free solder, and reflow that nicely. And because I'm changing this from the bias trim to the optical trim, I did have to change the intensity pot because the intensity pot is different in those two circuits. So this is a new reverse audio 50K here. And there's no remaining original solder throughout this amp. So all these pots, I cleaned up the old solder, including on the back of the cases and places like this. And these are new resistors, and just want it to be as good as possible. And the only way for me to guarantee that was to do it myself pretty much from scratch. And you can see that from the input jacks and the wipers of the volume pots, I'm using the shielded coaxial cable going to the grids of V1 and V2. The stuff that Fender used was okay, but the braid on it was just, it soaked up so much of that bad solder. It's not that lead-free solder is inherently bad. There are different grades of it, and the grade that Fender uses in these amps is kind of terrible. So I'm not a fan. If it had been good, I'd be using it, you know. But the good stuff is very expensive and still is not as good as leaded for the purposes of an amplifier where there's heat and vibration and stuff. Anyway, that's a whole other subject. Aside from this fuse holder and this fuse, every little thing came off this board, and all the solder came off this board, and it is a fairly flimsy bit of fiberglass. It's not a very high quality board, but it will suffice. And the layout that they suggest is not a very good one, and you can see places, and you'll see places in subsequent shots where I changed the layout, even just going straight, where they had a really artistic looking bend that just gives no mechanical support, has no electronic audible benefit anyway. And I've changed from the bias trim to the optical. I've got a lot of wiring to do before we resume this. So I think we're going to wrap this video up here, and we'll talk more about the choices I made on the board once you can see the whole thing and put together and hear it. But I think it's nice to point out that with the very few exceptions, like in here and here and here, there's almost no solder at this point. I haven't soldered most of it. Everything's bent over mechanically. So the components are not going anywhere, which means that when I do solder them, they're going to be really, really rock solid. But this is this is the starting point I like with a board, where all the components would pretty much work even without solder. You know, we're not going to test that theory here, but I've got a lot of wire to measure and snip and install. So I'll catch you guys on the next one. Thanks for watching.